In this video, we're going to learn how to plan a warp, which is the first step in weaving. We need to think about the threads that go through the loom, which is called the warp, and how long those threads are each going to be, and possibly the color choices that we need to make. This is a project that we're planning that's going to be a sampler, and in that sampler there are a few different patterns, and each of those patterns take about 1 or 2 inches to weave to get a good idea of what the pattern actually looks like. So we need that length in the warp to go through the process of practicing those patterns and seeing what those patterns actually will look like when we make the warp. So the first step is to create the warp, and in that process we are going to need to think about the length of the project, and that includes the finish length. And we need to understand how long that's going to be for future references, like how long is our rug going to be? Are we going to make more than one rug? Do we need to consider how many placemats, how many coasters, how many scarves? Because you can weave multiple projects at one time as long as you've planned ahead for that. So our finished length for our sampler is going to be at 60 inches. That's enough length for each of those patterns that are in the sampler to accomplish. That's also going to be including the hem, which is, or the fringe. And for our purposes, it doesn't matter as much, but it will if you have a rug that has fringe, placement that has fringe, a scarf that has fringe. So when I explain that, this could be the length of your warp, and this is each project. Let's pretend that this is a placemat, and this would be the fringe. And then another placemat, and then we need to allow for that fringe. So in that specific project, this placemat would be, 14 inches. And then we would want our fringe to at least be 3 inches on either side. If not, we could actually add more, so that would be 8 inches, just in case we needed to be able to tie those comfortably. So that would be 8 inches. So including all of these in the potential project, we need to add all these numbers up, and that would give us our finished length. Now for the sampler, we're just going to do one length of warp, and our ends are just going to be tied to the loom. And that would be our fringe and our hem. So in this project, we don't really need any because this part is just going to be extra. But if we were planning a specific project, we'd want to have all of those specific calculations. So with the hems and fringe, there's none. With loom allowance is how much of that warp do we need to be able to tie onto the back of the loom and to tie onto the front of the loom. And it's different for each size loom. A smaller loom is about 24 inches extra, which is mostly what samplers are put on. But larger floor loom, we would like 36 for that loom allowance. So for this project, it's going to be 24, because generally we do samplers on a smaller loom. The take-up, which is also important in other projects, not necessarily so much with a sampler, is 0 to 6 inches per yard. 0 to 6. And the reason that is so variable, if you are weaving with thread, you would want to put 0 because there's not much going on. It's not going to take up too much of that warp, because what that warp has to go over for the weft, which is what you weave with, the warp is so small it's not going to take up much of that warp. But if you're weaving a rag rug, you're going to use 6 inches per yard. And the reason that is, the rag has much more volume than the thread, and that warp needs to go over and under that rag, and more of that warp will be taken up. So when we're planning for this, we use a thinner thread, which is kind of like a string, and it's kind of in between, and we don't want to run out of length for our samplers. So I have just said that we would do 4 inches for the entire thing. There's less than 2 yards, but that is basically a good indication. We can overestimate. It's always better to overestimate how much you're actually going to need on the loom, because it's kind of disappointing and sad when you don't have enough warp to weave what you were planning. So always overestimate if you can. Sometimes materials are really expensive and you want to get it as close to that project as possible in order not to waste that. And always be mindful of how much you actually are wasting. So this is why we do calculations. So the total dress length is 100. Oh, sorry, we didn't have anything. So it is not 100. It is 88 inches. The paper's different. So 88 inches. And this is how long each thread going through the loom, each thread going through the loom is going to be 88 inches long. So the next part we need to calculate is the width. So each of those threads going through the loom is 88 inches long. We need to keep that in mind, because that will give us our yardage in the end of how much we actually need to have to make this project. So the first number we need is ends per inch. And for my samplers, I kind of like them to be tighter. And ends per inch is how many threads per inch are going to go through that loom. Sometimes it is basically the thread count. If you're looking at sheets that have a 600 thread count, that means there are 600 threads going through this loom per inch. So our ends per inch, tighter for us on a hand woven item without a machine, is 20 ends per inch. We can do 12 ends per inch, we can do 24 ends per inch, we can do 6 ends per inch. But for most hand woven items on a loom like I use, 20 to 36 is a tighter weave. So we're going to use 20 ends per inch. The width is going to be 8 inches because we're using a smaller loom. The width we can only weave with is generally about 14 inches wide, so we kind of want to keep it within that. So 8 inches. If we multiply 20 times 8, we get 160. And that is how many threads, because we're doing 20 threads and we're doing 8 inches, we get 160 threads. Now, in order to actually get the total yardage, we need to multiply 88 times 160, and that will give us our total inches. And then if we divide that by 36, we will get the total yards needed to plan the warp. So all of these calculations basically tell us how many threads are going through the loom and how much yardage we need to have in order to do that. Now, in winding the warp, we are going to have to plan out what we actually want to do for colors in a sampler, and we're only going to do it for the sampler. You can do this for a scarf, you can do this for a rug. I often have to do this for a more complicated pattern because color and pattern interact with each other. So in the sampler, this is going to be 8 inches wide, and it's 160 threads. So we're going to divide it into 4 parts. And in those 4 parts, each is going to have 40 threads. So within those 40 threads, we are going to divide up, and the colors are not going to be representative of the 40 threads, but it is just an indication of what we would like to put in those sections of the work. So the first part, my 2 colors are going to be orange and purple. So we're going to do half orange and half purple. So that would be 20 threads of orange and 20 threads of purple. So the second section is going to be 1 of each. So we're going to have 1, so they'll be alternating orange, purple, orange, purple, orange, purple. And for the third section, we're going to do 2 orange, 2 purple, 2 orange, 2 purple. And then for the third section, we're going to do 4 orange, 4 purple, 4 orange, and 4 purple. What's really fun about the last section when you're doing a sampler is that that's where the houndstooth happens. And I really, really like that pattern. So, I hope you have gotten this. But this is basically how I start out most students weaving. We start with a sampler, we get that under control, and then we move on to the larger projects.